Welcome to the Road Ahead podcast. I'm Ray Ghanbari, Chief Technology Officer at Omnitracs. I'll be your host for this ongoing series of podcasts that will bring you a myriad of professionals, both from inside and outside the transportation industry. My hope is that these conversations will be helpful to you as you're considering ideas and innovations that could transform your fleet financially, operationally, and safely. I hope you find these brief conversations thought-provoking and rewarding. I look forward to discussing ideas and topics that are outside our normal day-to-day, and we welcome your feedback. Today, we're continuing our discussion about cybersecurity with Homaira Akbari, President and CEO of AKnowledge Partners, a global strategy advisory firm, and with Steve Weber, Faculty Director for the Center of Long Term Cybersecurity at the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome back to both of you. Steve, what are the methods and motivations of these different classes of attackers? Which attackers and what kinds of attacks are going to be most relevant to the transportation sector?
Ray, I think you're absolutely right to talk about segments. I like to think about segmenting attackers the same way we might segment customers or populations. And typical ways we kind of think about doing that are by location, by sector, by experience and expertise, and by motivation. So really, because we're talking about the internet, of course, location is the least interesting. All the other segmentations, I think, really do matter. And let me just double down on the point that it is really important to segment because there is no such thing as an attacker. There are really different categories. So a couple of categories I think are really interesting and relevant for the transport sector and that we should talk about today. First of all, let's take one off the table. The lone cyber nerd, as it were, the image of the lone cyber nerd sitting in his basement with nothing better to do. I think this kind of stuff is not that relevant to the fairly sophisticated organizations in the transport sector. Those folks are doing other stuff that really isn't that relevant. I think what is important to pay attention to are what we now know are really multinational criminal networks. And I think it's fairly well understood. It wasn't 4 or 5 years ago, but I think now it's fairly well understood that these are really highly professionalized and highly organized money-making enterprises. More like global drug cartels or call them illegal multinational enterprises than like, say, high school gangs. These groups are well-resourced, they're evolving, they have sophisticated business models, they invest in technology and they have an expectation of return on investment. They probably have their own equivalent of boards of directors in some respects. These are motivated principally by money, principally financial. The short-term illustration of that is obviously, again, the most recent sort of epidemic of ransomware and hostage taking. There's longer-term possibilities that the transport sector needs to think about with these folks as well. Logic bombs, autonomous vehicle system disruption. I know that Homaira is going to talk about that. Data set poisoning, and so on. And I think the most important thing to recognize about this segment, again, is that it, like a sophisticated organization, it's quickly evolving. You could go out there on the dark web now and buy malware as a service. There's probably futures trading, maybe even options trading on future revenue streams from these organizations. This is not schlock behavior. This is highly organized criminal networks. That's the first segment. Second segment that I think is really important to pay attention to, obviously, are the state actors that are serious players. And look, there's more than 5, probably, and less than 10 state actors that can do really bad things to sophisticated organizations. We know they are China, Israel, North Korea, Russia, Iran. I think it's important to recognize there will likely be more of these in the next few years. The proliferation is going to continue. The nature of this kind of asymmetric warfare is that it always favors the weak. And so it is a tool that more state actors are going to look for. Some state actors are in it for the money. People typically think of North Korea in that context. Some are in it for intelligence, both short and long term. People think of China and Russia in that context. And let me just note that this is sometimes very sophisticated intelligence. Like if you had a data set from various transport companies and you were able to combine that with other data sets that you've stolen, for example, from hotels or banks, you can do some pretty interesting intelligence things and inferences about who is what. Some states are in it for geopolitical power, some for contingency planning and pre-positioning of force in the face of a conflict. We see that in the context of intrusion into industrial control systems, water plants and such. And so state actors. Finally, is the gray area in between. And I think in some ways, this is the hardest to deal with from a defense and deterrence perspective. These are the parastatal criminal organizations that are sort of state actors and sort of private actors, but are actually in the gray area in between. They're analogous to some of the drug cartels that are acting in symbiosis, say, with state governments in some Latin American countries. This is a tricky space because we have plausible deniability for governments and we have sovereign protection for criminals at the same time. They have access sometimes to state actor quality tools, and they have this peculiar mix of financial and geopolitical motivations. So just to wrap that back around, if I were sitting in the transport sector, these gray area actors are the ones that I would worry the most about and try hardest to understand.
Wow, that's actually pretty scary to contemplate, to be a fleet owner and to be thinking about, one of these in between state supported actors coming after you. But Homaira, as it seems like intuitively, as vehicles are getting more smarter, more connected, and eventually more autonomous, they're going to be more at risk and more exposed to these cyber attacks. As fleets move to these smarter vehicles and eventually to autonomous vehicles, how does this change how they need to be thinking about cybersecurity? And how should motor carriers really have to change how they manage all this cybersecurity risk that they're starting to take on?
Yeah, in our first podcast, Steve spoke to cyber risk in IoT. Well, autonomous vehicles are part of that IoT ecosystem and one of the largest threats, in fact. Even before we get to autonomous, we know that cars from every OEM have already been hacked. But let's focus on autonomous vehicles and why they are more vulnerable and that the fleets have to care about them. To give you rough estimates, today, a modern car, which already has a set of sophisticated software-driven functionality, uses 100 million lines of code. 100 million. Self-driving cars will require an estimated of 1 billion lines of computer code, almost 1,000 times more than the 145,000 lines required by NASA to land Apollo 11 on the moon. So let's understand why we will have so many more lines of code. It's because the interaction of an autonomous vehicle with its surroundings is much more than that of Apollo 11. Autonomous vehicles, whether it is a car or a truck, use artificial intelligence systems which employ machine learning techniques to collect, analyze, and transfer data as they go through highways and urban roads with hundreds and thousands of obstacles, including other cars, buildings, human beings. So they need to collect and analyze all this data in real time and in real situations, and are working non-stop to recognize traffic signs and road markings, to detect other vehicles, estimate their speed, to plan the path ahead, and to make decisions that in conventional cars or trucks are taken by us, humans, whose brains contain the best of, in my opinion, software codes in the world. These systems, by the way, like all IT systems, rely on AI and are vulnerable to attacks that could compromise the proper functioning of the vehicle. Hackers taking over an autonomous vehicle can do a lot of damage, obviously, including they can weaponize an autonomous vehicle to attack many valuable and sensitive targets. I would say automotive and truck industries lack a standard approach and full sophistication to deal with cybersecurity across their entire value chains, from tier one and other suppliers to their own manufacturing and operations, to their dealers and post-sale digital mobility ecosystem. For example, Ray, imagine there are concerns about how much data vehicles are generating about their owners and how this information is being stored, shared, and used. The industry in general is focused on implementing continuous risk assessment processes supported by threat intelligence in generally and specifically to identify potential AI risks and emerging threats related to the uptake of AI in autonomous driving. Areas of attention are to embed cybersecurity by design and to increase industry's level of preparedness, reinforcing its incident response capabilities. I think, personally, while all of these are good, we need to go deeper. We need an application-aware workload protection, something like what Virsec, a company which is based out of San Jose, is doing, which is effectively a lightweight sensor in the application's runtime, continuously verifying the application's execution progress against its golden image, which can protect against any vulnerability, including against undisclosed or signatureless vulnerabilities. So, Ray, to conclude, my view is the industry has a long, and I mean a long way to go.
Well, Steve, clearly the amount of benefit to the bad guys is only getting bigger, and the amount of exposure to the good guys is getting bigger at the same time. And we aren't necessarily keeping up or getting ahead as fast as we can. So what should the transportation industry be doing over the next, say, 3 to 5 years so that we're not constantly playing catch up, where we could actually start getting more proactive and staying ahead of these bad guys?
Ray, I think that's exactly the right question to sort of point people towards this future orientation. And let's acknowledge it's a really, really hard thing to do when you're focused on trying to clean up today's emergency, to spend the time and energy and resources and frankly the mental space it takes to think about what the world's going to look like 3 to 5 years from now. And yet it's so essential. Many times in conversations with CISOs, I feel like I'm back in an emergency department at a hospital where the mindset is like, look, we just got to deal with what comes in the door today, and we kind of patch it up and we send it back out and think that there's somebody else out there taking care of the long term. Unfortunately, I think today a CISO's job is to be all at once the emergency room physician, the public health physician, and the preventive care doc, and to do all of those jobs every single day. And I think it's reflected in some of what we see in both turnover and stress among CISOs. This isn't meant to be unfriendly to CISOs, but like, if your CISO doesn't look stressed, you probably have a problem. It's a really, really hard job. So having said that, what's a reasonable investment strategy? I kind of think in an environment that's moving this quickly, you kind of have to think about basics. And so let me name a couple of those where I think people ought to be spending their time, energy, and resources. First, every CISO has to find a way to measure, explain, and start to chip away at the tech debt that's out there. Legacy systems, these are often the backdoor to some of the attackers looking for a kind of a window, and you got to fix those things. And that requires, in some cases, making unpopular demands against new functionality. The norm of internet culture has always been push to the edge of what you think the technology can possibly do, and then go a little bit further. And nobody wants to hear about the tech debt. We got to go back and fix these legacy systems from the 1980s before we can extend what we're doing today. I think it's a really hard job for CISOs to make that argument, but I think they got to be making that argument. So that's the first thing. The second thing is invest in people, the security operations center people. I like to think of folks spread throughout the enterprise who are savvy as kind of your distributed security operations center throughout the enterprise. And frankly, board allies who really understand the value of what the security organization is doing, not just seeing it as a cost center, but seeing it as an investment piece of the business, which creates the possibility to do the things you want to be able to do and stops you from getting caught in traps where there are really interesting things you would want to do, but you don't do because you're not confident in security. And think about the picture that Homaira just kind of painted of an autonomous vehicle sector that could be held back, creating unbelievable amount of value that could be held back because we don't have confidence in the security. The third point, I think we have to invest in processes for kind of basic hygiene. Make sure that we're getting all the basics right, make them repeatable, make them measurable. Maybe the mantra here is practice, practice, practice. You know, we're doing this podcast in August, and it's NFL training camp season. And for fans of American football, it's really interesting to watch NFL coaches. They're training their professional players in the very, very basics. Hand placement, foot placement. They don't do this, you know, they're not working on super fancy stuff. They're just making sure that the basics of blocking, tackling, and football are absolutely embedded in every player's mind, like muscle memory. And I think the same kind of mindset needs to go for basic hygiene in cyber. Fourth point, I believe in red teaming. We're dealing with adaptive adversaries. I believe in scenario planning, longer term models of how the game might change, not just sort of high, medium, and low projections, but really fundamentally different scenarios. You know, if you think about cloud migration, for example, the sort of landscape you need to kind of consider is not just all, some, very little. It's about really what might be happening in the cloud 5 years from now. Are we talking about federated learning? Are we talking about quantum compute? Which is included but not limited to things like quantum decryption and encryption. It may seem really, really hard for a CISO trying to whack-a-mole to be thinking about preparing his or her organization for quantum 3, 5, 7 years out. But if we don't do it now, we're just going to be playing whack-a-mole again 5 years from now. And then finally, just to wrap it around, I think bizarrely, maybe the most important investment strategy is around relationships. You know, CISOs talk to CISOs as well as to their own organizations. They're involved in lots of different kind of informal data sharing agreements with competitors, with collaborators, with government officials, public-private partnerships. These things are super, super essential because, like the internet itself, information is the key. A CISO that is isolated from those information flows that are taking place in the industry is a CISO that's trying to fight the world on his or her own. And trusted relationships really matter a lot. The last point I would make in that context is, and it's something that I think the best CISOs really, really understand, truly being integrated into the business roadmap of the organization is what cements those relationships with the people who make the decisions about investment strategy. And CISOs need to be not just emergency room docs, public health docs, preventive care docs, but they also need to be business people. It is a hard job, but they have to do it.
Homaira, in addition to these long-term investments that Steve spoke about, what are the three things you would recommend that fleets do today to protect their systems, their people, and their assets against cyber attackers?
Yeah, I'm going to answer to this question in an unconventional way, a little bit more prescriptive, but they do run parallels with what Steve already said. So I'm going to highlight three things in a prescriptive way. First, I would ask every fleet, speaking to them directly, is to put in place a cybersecurity team and devise an effective cybersecurity strategy. First and foremost, realize you have vulnerabilities, you have valuable data and assets that need to be protected, and that you're actually going to be hacked. I emphasize valuable data and assets because I hear from many transportation companies telling me, oh, but transportation doesn't have interesting data like financial services do or healthcare. But as discussed earlier, the game of cyber attacks has changed, and ransomware is somewhat agnostic to industry and company size. So to devise an effective cybersecurity strategy, and no matter how small or large you are, I highly recommend that you engage external third-party advisors. And this shouldn't be if you're outsourcing your IT, which many especially smaller transportation companies are doing. Don't ask that IT vendor to provide you with your cyber strategy, because much of your security must be superimposed on their environment, and they will be the last ones to let you know what their vulnerabilities are. So go after recognizing the top third-party companies like Coalfire and IBM has one, and there were a number of others that you can hire depending on your size, and have them to provide an assessment of your current effectiveness and important insights and powerful foundation advice to make sure that you have the right strategy. Secondly, this is very similar to Steve's third point, which is with the help of the same third party, device metrics to measure your cybersecurity hygiene and effectiveness and track your progress and create awareness among your employees, suppliers, distributors, and even your customers. I know of companies now who are training or creating awareness among their customers, because even your customers can cause a breach. On metrics, don't only rely on external security scoring companies, but have your own metrics which measure there are basically 4 areas you need to measure: your digital asset and network health, your insider threat, your external threat, and your threat mitigation effectiveness. These are the 4 major areas. And there are metrics that happily we can provide you. On awareness, train your employees repeatedly, demand your suppliers to adhere to highest standards and perform actually red team testing, which Steve was mentioning, of your key suppliers, and educate your entire chain of distributors, agents, and your customers. And then finally, the last one is realize cybersecurity is a moving target. Hackers are very smart and many are supported by nation states, again, as Steve segmented them nicely. Make sure your cyber team is part of industry's information flow. Again, the same thing that Steve was highlighting. To the point that I made in our first episode, share information and be member of public-private collaboration and industry associations. This is quite open. And then be open and don't be afraid to try new and emerging cyber vendors. That's a really key point. Always have a certain amount of budget for these new guys, even though some of them will be successful and some of them may not. Because this is where the innovation is happening. For example, a company like Omni, where SaaS is very important now, they provide a SaaS security management platform. They're truly the best in class in this. And I know everyone who I talk to worries about SaaS security on cloud. So with that note, Ray, I want to personally thank you for giving me and Steve this opportunity to share our ideas with you.
Well, thank you, Homaira and Steve. We appreciate you sharing your insights with us. Cybersecurity is something that we all wish we didn't have to think about and worry about, but the reality is we don't really have a choice. And so thank you for sharing your expertise and your recommendations with us. You've been listening to the Road Ahead podcast from Omnitracs. I hope these few minutes you've spent with us provided ideas and innovations that could transform your fleet financially, operationally, and safely. For other podcasts and information, please go to omnitracs.com. I look forward to you joining us again for our next Road Ahead podcast.